He sat there in his $3,000 suit, laughing with his high-priced shark of a lawyer, pointing at the empty chair beside his wife. Keith thought the divorce was already over. He thought stripping Grace of her bank accounts meant she would crumble. He even told the judge she was too incompetent to hire counsel, but Keith forgot one crucial detail about Grace's past, specifically, who gave birth to her. When the courtroom doors swung open and she walked in, the smirk didn't just vanish from Keith's face, the color drained from his entire existence. You are about to witness the most brutal courtroom takedown in history. The air inside courtroom 304 of the Manhattan Civil Courthouse was stale, smelling faintly of floor wax and old paper. It was the scent of ending things. For Keith Simmons, however, the atmosphere smelled like victory. Keith adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Italian suit, leaning back in the leather chair at the plaintiff's table. He checked his watch, a vintage Patek Philippe that cost more than the average American's car, and let out a sharp, derisive exhale through his nose. "She's late," Keith whispered to the man beside him. Or maybe she finally realized it's cheaper to just give up. Beside him sat Garrison Ford. Garrison wasn't just a lawyer, he was a weapon. Senior partner at Ford, Miller and O'Connell, he was known in New York legal circles as the Butcher of Broadway. He didn't just win divorce cases, he incinerated the opposition until there was nothing left but ash and a favorable settlement. Garrison smoothed his silver tie, his eyes scanning the docket with predatory boredom. "It doesn't matter if she shows up, Keith," Garrison murmured, his voice like gravel grinding on glass. "We filed the emergency motion to freeze the joint assets on Monday. She has no access to liquidity. No retainer means no representation. No representation against me means she walks away with whatever scraps we decide to toss her." Keith smirked, looking across the aisle. Sitting there, alone, was Grace. She looked smaller than Keith remembered. She wore a simple, charcoal grey dress that she'd owned for years. Her hands were folded neatly on the scarred oak table, her fingers interlaced so tightly that her knuckles were white. There were no stacks of files in front of her, no paralegals whispering strategy, no pitcher of ice water, just Grace, staring straight ahead at the empty judge's bench. "Look at her," Keith chuckled, loud enough for the few spectators in the back to hear. "Pathetic. I almost feel bad for her. It's like watching a deer waiting for a semi-truck." "Focus," Garrison warned, though a small smile played on his lips. "Judge Henderson is a stickler for decorum. Let's get this done quickly. I have a lunch reservation at Le Bernardin at 1. Don't worry, Garrison. By 1 o'clock, I'll be a free man, and she'll be looking for a studio apartment in Queens." The bailiff, a heavy-set man named Officer Kowalski, who had seen enough divorces to lose faith in humanity twice over, bellowed out, "All rise. The Honorable Judge Lawrence P. Henderson presiding." The room shuffled to its feet. Judge Henderson swept in, his black robes billowing. He was a man of sharp angles and short patience, known for clearing his docket with ruthless efficiency. He took his seat, adjusted his spectacles, and peered down at the parties. "Be seated," Henderson commanded. He opened the file in front of him. "Case number 24, Civ 0091, Simmons versus Simmons. We are here for the preliminary hearing regarding the division of assets and the petition for spousal support." Henderson looked at the plaintiff's table. "Mr. Ford, good to see you again." "And you, Your Honor," Garrison said, standing smoothly. "We are ready to proceed." The judge turned his gaze to the defense table. He frowned. Grace stood up slowly. "Mrs. Simmons," Judge Henderson said, his voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room. "I see you are alone. Are you expecting counsel?" Grace cleared her throat. Her voice was soft, trembling slightly. I am, Your Honor." She should be here any minute. Keith let out a loud, theatrical scoff. He covered his mouth with his hand, but the sound was unmistakable. Judge Henderson's eyes darted to Keith. "Is there something amusing, Mr. Simmons?" Garrison Ford stood up immediately, placing a restraining hand on Keith's shoulder. "Apologies, Your Honor. My client is simply frustrated. This process has been dragged out, and the strain is significant." "Keep your client's frustration silent, Mr. Ford," the judge warned. He turned back to Grace. "Mrs. Simmons, court began 5 minutes ago. You know the rules. If your attorney is not present—" "She's coming," Grace insisted, her voice gaining a fraction more strength. "There was traffic." "Traffic," Keith muttered, leaning forward so his voice carried across the aisle. "Or maybe the check bounced, Grace?" "Oh wait, you can't write a check. I cancelled the cards this morning." "Mr. Simmons," the judge banged his gavel. "One more outburst and I will hold you in contempt." "My apologies, Your Honor," Keith said, standing up and buttoning his jacket, feigning humility. I want to be fair here. My wife is clearly confused. She doesn't understand the complexity of the law. She has no income, no resources. I offered her a generous settlement last week, $50,000 and the 2018 Lexus. She refused. Keith turned to look at Grace, his eyes cold and dead. "I tried to help you, Grace, but you insisted on playing games. Now look at you, sitting there with nothing. You don't have a lawyer because nobody wants a charity case." "Mr. Ford, control your client," Judge Henderson snapped. "Your Honor," Garrison Ford interjected smoothly, "while my client's passion is regrettable, his point is valid. We are wasting the court's time. Mrs. Simmons clearly has not secured representation. Under the precedent of Vargas versus State, we move to proceed immediately with a default judgment on the asset division. She has had months to prepare." Judge Henderson looked at Grace. He looked tired. "Mrs. Simmons, Mr. Ford is technically correct. The court's time is valuable. If you cannot produce an attorney right now, I have to assume you are representing yourself, pro se. And given the complexity of the forensic accounting involved in your husband's estate, that would be ill-advised." "I am not representing myself," Grace said, her eyes fixed on the double mahogany doors at the back of the room. "Please, just 2 more minutes." "She's stalling," Keith hissed. "She's got nobody. Her father was a mechanic, and her friends are all suburban housewives. Who is she going to call? Ghostbusters?" Keith laughed again, a cruel, barking sound. He felt invincible. He looked at Grace, the woman he had vowed to love and cherish, and saw only an obstacle he was about to crush. He wanted to humiliate her. He wanted her to know that leaving him was the biggest mistake of her life. "Your Honor," Garrison pressed, sensing the kill. "I move to strike her request for a continuance. Let's end this charade." Judge Henderson sighed. He picked up his gavel. "Mrs. Simmons, I'm sorry. We cannot wait any longer. We will proceed with—" Bam! The double doors at the back of the courtroom didn't just open. They were thrown wide with a force that rattled the frames. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Everyone turned. Keith spun around in his chair, annoyed at the interruption. Garrison Ford frowned, his pen hovering over his notepad. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Standing in the doorway was not a frazzled public defender. It was not a cheap strip mall lawyer. Standing there was a woman who looked to be in her late 60s, though her posture was as rigid as a steel beam. She wore a tailored white suit that cost more than Keith's entire wardrobe. Her silver hair was cut into a sharp, terrifyingly precise bob. She wore dark sunglasses, which she slowly removed, revealing eyes of piercing, icy blue. Eyes that had stared down senators and CEOs. Behind her walked 3 junior associates, all carrying thick leather briefcases, moving in a V formation like fighter jets, escorting a bomber. The woman didn't rush. She walked down the center aisle, the click of her heels sounding like a metronome counting down Keith's remaining time on Earth. Garrison Ford, the butcher of Broadway, dropped his pen. His mouth opened slightly. His face, usually a mask of arrogance, went pale. "No," Garrison whispered, a genuine tremor in his voice. "That's impossible." "Who is that?" Keith asked, confused by his lawyer's reaction. "Is that her mum?" "Grace's mum is dead. She told me she was an orphan." The woman reached the defense table. She didn't look at Grace. She didn't look at the judge. She turned slowly and looked directly at Keith Simmons. She smiled, but it wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile a shark gives before it drags a seal into the depths. "Sorry I'm late," she said, her voice smooth, cultured, and projecting to every corner of the room without a microphone. "I had to file a few motions with the Supreme Court regarding your finances, Mr. Simmons. It took longer than expected to list all your offshore accounts." Keith froze. Judge Henderson leaned forward, his eyes wide. "Counselor, state your name for the record." The woman placed a gold-embossed business card on the stenographer's desk. She turned to the judge. "Catherine Bennett," she said, "Senior Managing Partner at Bennett, Crown and Sterling of Washington, D.C. I am entering my appearance as counsel for the defendant." She paused, then looked at Keith again. "And," she added, "I am also her mother." The silence that followed Catherine Bennett's introduction was absolute. It was the kind of silence that usually follows a bomb blast. Keith Simmons blinked, his brain trying to process the information. "Mother?" he stammered, looking from the imposing woman in white to his trembling wife. "Grace, you said your mother was... You said she was gone." Grace finally looked up, her eyes wet but her chin high. "I said she was gone from my life, Keith. I didn't say she was dead. We were estranged. Until yesterday." "Estranged," Catherine Bennett repeated, the word rolling off her tongue like a verdict. She moved around the defense table, taking the chair beside Grace. She didn't hug her daughter. Not yet. This was business. She placed a heavy briefcase on the table and snapped the latches open. "Grace left home 20 years ago to escape the pressure of my world. She wanted a simple life. She wanted to be loved for who she was, not the Bennett name." Catherine turned her gaze to Garrison Ford. The opposing lawyer was currently trying to make himself look smaller in his chair. "Hello, Garrison," Catherine said pleasantly. "I haven't seen you since the Oracle Tech merger litigation in 2015. You were barely an associate then, weren't you? Fetching coffee for the real lawyers?" Garrison Ford cleared his throat, his face flushing a deep red. "Miss Bennett, it is an honor. I didn't know you were admitted to the bar in New York." "I am admitted to the bar in New York, California, D.C., and before the International Court of Justice in The Hague," she replied, not breaking eye contact. "I generally handle constitutional law and multi-billion-dollar corporate mergers. But when my daughter called me weeping, telling me that a mid-level marketing executive with a Napoleon complex was bullying her," Catherine paused, letting the insult land. "I decided to make an exception." "Objection!" Keith yelled, standing up. Panic was starting to set in. Personal attack. Who does she think she is? "Sit down, Mr. Simmons," Judge Henderson barked. The judge looked at Catherine with a mix of reverence and fear. Everyone in the legal world knew the name Catherine Bennett. She was known as the Iron Gavel. She had argued 14 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court and won 12. She was a myth. "Ms. Bennett," Judge Henderson said, his tone respectful. "While your reputation precedes you, we are in the middle of a hearing regarding asset division. Mr. Ford has filed a motion for default judgment." "Yes, I saw that motion," Catherine said, pulling a file from her briefcase. "It was cute, sloppy but cute." She stood up and walked toward the bench, handing a thick stack of documents to the bailiff to give to the judge. She dropped a duplicate stack onto Garrison Ford's desk with a heavy thud. "Mr. Ford claims my client has no assets and no representation. That is now moot. Furthermore, Mr. Simmons claims that the assets in question, the penthouse on Fifth Avenue, the house in the Hamptons, and the portfolio at Goldman Sachs are his sole property, protected by a prenuptial agreement signed 7 years ago." "That prenup is ironclad," Keith shouted. "She gets nothing. She signed it." Catherine turned to Keith. She took off her glasses again. "Mr. Simmons, do you know who wrote the standard template for the spousal coercion clause used in the state of New York?" Keith blinked. "What?" "I did," Catherine said softly. "In 1998, I drafted the legislation that defines exactly what constitutes coercion when signing a marital contract." She tapped the document on Garrison's table. "And according to the sworn affidavit my daughter provided this morning, you threatened to kill her cat and cut off her access to her sick grandmother's nursing home funds if she didn't sign that paper the night before the wedding." The courtroom gasped. "That's a lie!" Keith screamed, his face turning purple. "She's a liar!" "We also have the text messages from that night," Catherine continued, her voice rising just enough to cut through his shouting. "Recovered from the cloud server you thought you wiped. Exhibit C, Your Honor." Judge Henderson flipped to Exhibit C. His eyebrows shot up. Garrison Ford was flipping through the pages frantically. Sweat was beading on his forehead. "Your Honor, we haven't had time to review this evidence. This is an ambush." "An ambush?" Catherine laughed. It was a terrifying sound. "Mr. Ford, you tried to default judgment a woman with no lawyer while your client mocked her to her face. You don't get to complain about fairness. Now, let's talk about the finances." Catherine turned back to the gallery, addressing the room as if she were lecturing a class of law students. "Mr. Simmons claims his net worth is roughly $8 million, a respectable sum for a man of his limited talents." Keith looked like he was about to have a stroke. "However," Catherine said, pulling out a second, thicker binder, "my team of forensic accountants, who, by the way, usually track terrorist financing for the Pentagon, spent the last 12 hours tracing the intricate web of shell companies Mr. Simmons set up in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus." She dropped the second binder. Thud. "It appears, Your Honor, that Mr. Simmons has been funneling marital assets into a holding company called Apex Ventures for 5 years. The total amount hidden is not $8 million. Catherine leaned in close to Keith, her face inches from his. "It's $24 million, and since you failed to disclose it on your financial affidavit, signed under penalty of perjury this morning..." Catherine smiled at the judge. "That constitutes felony fraud." Keith slumped back into his chair. He looked at Garrison. "Do something!" he hissed. Garrison Ford looked at the documents. He looked at the judge, who was glaring at Keith with burning intensity. Then he looked at Catherine Bennett, who was checking her manicured nails. "I need a recess," Garrison croaked. "Request denied," Judge Henderson said instantly. "I want to hear more about these Cayman accounts. Ms. Bennett, please proceed." Catherine smoothed her skirt. "Thank you, Your Honor. But before we get to the fraud, I'd like to address the matter of the mockery my client endured regarding her lack of a lawyer." She walked back to Grace and placed a hand on her shoulder.